Well, welcome to the Fiscal and Economics discussion. This is the August 2024 discussion group. A little bit about the group that is sponsoring this. We are an indivisible group. We're located just outside of O'Hare Airport. We call it the Northwest Suburbs, and we have 5,400 members locally. This particular discussion group has a national and international draw, because a lot of people are very interested to know exactly what is going on in our economy. Is it horrible, as Trump likes to say, disaster, or is it one of the most spectacular economic runs that we've ever had? David Doney, who has been with us for 8 years as one of the co-leads, tonight will be our presenter, and he does an excellent job of not only organizing information to present to you, but he does an excellent job of explaining it. So it is a conversation. You'll see a presentation, but if you have a question, put your hand up and ask the question, or you can actually interrupt David to ask him the question and he will explain it. No question is too little or too hard. There may be some that we have to put out for a month while we look it up, but I think you'll enjoy it. I have been doing this. I was one of the first leads of this group back almost 12 years ago. And it has certainly improved an awful lot over the years. So David Doney, please start your presentation. And folks, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Bill. All right. Can you guys see that?
We can.
All right. So thank you, Bill. Lots going on in the economy, as always. This group, what we try to do is help you understand the facts. And so you can sharpen whatever arguments you're making to your audience, whether that's social media or arguing with your friends. However you choose to deliver this, there are a lot of slides in here that you can cut and paste right into the internet where you would like. And please do. Feel free to use these as much as you like. So typically what we do is we go through the labor market. So that's the jobs and the unemployment rate. This time we had a GDP report, so we'll go through that, which is the size of the economy or economic growth. We'll look at the household financial position, so that gets into wages and inflation. And then a variety of sort of miscellaneous economic indicators and other facts that we pick up during the month that may be of interest to the group. So just by way of introduction, trying to understand where the economy is at any given time can be confusing because there's so many numbers, and there isn't just one that tells you the whole picture. And so this slide kind of summarizes what we'll talk about during this meeting. And also there's another version of this slide that has all these numbers in great detail in it. I didn't want to hit you at the beginning with 500 little facts on the one page, so we keep it simple here. But the real, whenever you hear the word real, that means inflation adjusted. You'll hear it a lot in this meeting. And then when I say percentile, I mean, what percent of the time are things better or worse than the current state? And generally, when I'm talking about percentile, I mean, better than a certain percentage of our history for that particular measure. So for example, real hourly wages for workers are 99th percentile. So they're almost at a record level. They're higher than 99% of monthly observations going back to 1964. And recently they went up. So not only is the level extremely high historically, but they're changing in the right direction for workers. And so I'm giving that a green rating. Think of that like a stoplight. Red would be bad, green is good, yellow's in the middle. Real GDP per person. So size of the economy adjusted for inflation and for population is at a record level, and it went up in the last reading. Jobs are at a record level. You got the most people working ever, and that number also went up last month and has gone up for the last three, almost 4 years now, without going down at all. Every month is adding to that record, but the pace is slowing a little bit. The unemployment rate, which was 4.3% last month, is about 78th percentile, so lower than 78% of our history. The average unemployment rate is about 5.7% for scale on that one. And that one, though, is going up. And so I'm tagging that as a yellow. That's the main indicator that people are watching very carefully right now. Though, as you know, people that follow the stock market, we hit a record very recently, and we've just come off that record a little bit. We are up year to date, so that's a green one. And then the employment to population ratio is kind of adjusts for, it's a measure of participation, and we're using the age 25 to 54 because that avoids distortion from people that are increasingly retiring as the country ages or are choosing to go to school. This is really what's going on in that key, typically working age. Historically, we're at 94th percentile. We actually happen to be tied for the highest level in about 20 years, 23 years, and it's also gone up lately. So green. So the dashboard, when you look at different kinds of key measures, is looking green in almost every area except for one, which is the unemployment rate. So when you look at jobs, about 6.4 million more are working than before the pandemic. So that's the good news. The jobs were up about 114,000 in July, and there were minor adjustments made, so not really a meaningful adjustment. But if you want to account for it, it means we had really an 85,000 increase versus what was previously reported. And the job creation's averaging a record 376,000 a month under Biden. That's almost 16 million jobs added. Divided by 42 months gives you the 376,000. So we're almost adding 16 million jobs under Biden. And I'll show you a sort of a discounted version of that from that July 22 point when we regained the pre-pandemic peak. So as of June 2022, we've been above the pre-pandemic level of jobs. So right in here, all of this, even if you just count that, we're at 255,000 a month, which is still a rapid pace. This is a fantastic jobs record and a very rapid recovery compared to our history. So these are really good numbers. And again, we've been in record territory since June of 2022. In terms of what's been happening, the 3-month average is helpful to understand kind of the trend so that you're not overemphasizing one single month. So for example, over the last 3 months, we've been averaging about 170,000 jobs a month, which is a very solid number, but it's been coming down. It's below those averages I just mentioned. And the Council of Economic Advisors estimates that you need between 100,000 and 200,000 to keep the unemployment rate steady. This is an example last month where it was about 114,000, and we saw the unemployment rate go up, as I'll show you in a little bit. And I'll explain why some of that's happening. We're seeing something unusual, which is a very large increase in the labor force, which is driving some of those unemployment numbers. When you look at sort of a comparison of relevant periods, Biden from July 22 through the latest month, so through the month of July, 255,000 jobs on average per month being created. From inauguration, 376,000. If you compare that to Trump for 4 years, including the pandemic, he actually lost jobs. He's the only president since World War II that ended up with fewer jobs than when he started. But if you just gross that up and you talk about that pre-pandemic period, he was at 180,000 a month. And even Obama's second term at 216,000 a month was faster than Trump pre-pandemic. So these are very fast job creation rates compared to recent sort of aggregates there. For the unemployment rate, there's two that we talk about typically. The U3 is the number that you always hear about in the news. That's when they say the unemployment rate is 4.3%. That's what you hear in the news. They rarely report the U6. The U6 gives you a wider view of some additional people that are considered unemployed. So it just widens the definition of unemployment. And you can see that in both cases, when Biden started, the unemployment rate was 6.4. Now it's 4.3. In the U6, it was 11.1. Now it's 7.8. Both of those numbers jumped in the last month, and so we've got to keep an eye on that. We want to make sure that we hope that doesn't continue, that the Fed can intervene by cutting interest rates, adjusting their bond buying to help boost the economy, to avoid seeing those numbers go up. So for a while, we were at a very low rate. The 2022 and 2023 averages were only 3.6%. That you have to go back to 1969 for 3.5% year. So 2022 and 2023 had historically low unemployment. And even this number, 4.3, is about 78th percentile. It's lower than about 78% of our history. And for this one, back to 1948. So the long streak that we had ended, but we're still at a very low unemployment rate level historically, but it's headed the wrong way. You may have heard the news, something called the Sahm rule. Claudia Sahm is an economist. She's active on Twitter. We've had back and forth. She worked for the Fed. She's very helpful in trying to understand kind of what's going on. And the Sahm rule is a recession indicator. And the math is a little tricky, but what she does is here's the unemployment rate. Here is what's a 3-month rolling average. So this 4.1 is like an average of that 4.0, the 4.1, and the 4.3. So that's the 4.1. It's a 3-month rolling average. And then the rule asks, what is the lowest over 12 months, which is the lowest reading of the last 12? So if you look at all these yellow ones, what was the lowest reading in there? And that was 3.6. And so we bring that over. And then you take the 4.1 minus the 3.6, and that's where you get 0.5. 0.5 is the threshold, the trigger. So what she's saying, or what this rule says, is that the unemployment rate has been going up enough to where it looks like we're in a recession if you just use the unemployment rate alone. And historically, what's happened is the Sahm rule has been very accurate. It was designed to be. She analyzed historical recessions and tried to figure out, okay, well, what's the unemployment rate doing, and developed this rule. It doesn't have false positives, meaning there's always been a recession when you have the Sahm rule trigger. This one may be different, but we shall see. To give you a little history, let me show you this timeline, and we'll use the Great Recession to kind of talk about the context of what was happening and how kind of recessions get called by the National Bureau of Economic Research, the NBER. So the Great Recession officially went from December 2007 to June 2009. Remember, this is the one that happened after the big housing crash and was a really miserable time for everyone, a very severe recession. And it took a long time to recover from that. The Sahm rule triggered, so it hit 0.5 in February of 2008. It wasn't until December of 2008 that NBER actually called that recession start. So we didn't know we were in a recession in December. It was not officially declared until a year later, December 2008, but the Sahm rule had already triggered. And so we're at that stage, sort of, if you will, of it doesn't have to be a recession that's this bad, but the Sahm rule has triggered, but NBER has not called a recession, and they might not for a while, and they may never call one, at least until, they might not call one now. Back in December 2007, before that, the unemployment rate hit its low in May of that year, and the jobs peak happened in January of 2008, so just after the start. So we know we've come off an unemployment rate low, but we have not hit a jobs peak yet, meaning we continue to add jobs every month. And in this case, the GDP peaked in the second quarter of 2008. So it peaked a little bit after the official recession was called, as of December 2008. At the time, we didn't know it was a peak, and so NBER then called the recession then. But the peak was after, the official start of the recession. And we're in that situation where GDP has not peaked yet; it's still going up, and the jobs have not peaked yet. So when you think about the Sahm rule and it says, well, it indicates a recession. In this case, there was a jobs peak and a GDP peak. We haven't hit those yet. That could change next month, but it hasn't happened yet. So we'll keep your eye on, don't just look at the unemployment rate, keep your eye on these three guys to see what's really happening. In June of 2009, so when they told us, when NBER then reported in September 2010 that the recession was over, so they waited how many months? June of 2009 to September of 10, so almost more than a year before they said we're out of the recession. Real GDP hit the bottom in the second quarter of 2009, so right around the time here. But the unemployment rate didn't hit high until October of 2009. And the jobs trough hit in February of 2010. So they sort of said the recession's over before a couple of other things kind of, continued to get worse. So we'll see what happens going forward, but it doesn't surprise me that people are confused when they hear about, are we in a recession or are we not in a recession? The SOM rule triggered, how to think about this. I just wanted to give you a little history that shows, yeah, you can have the SOM rule trigger and all three of these key measures sort of peaked, or it hit their lows already, like in the case of the unemployment rate was coming off a bit. But in this case today, we have not, only one of the threes hit that trigger. These other two have not peaked. So we'll see if NBR is going to call a recession happening now in July of 2024, or if it may not feel that we're in a recession, and it could be, a long time before a recession actually kicks in. The SOM rule is not the only mousetrap here. This is another rule that uses and I don't want, the details are here, I don't want to get into it. They're using the vacancy rate, which has to do with how many job openings relative to the size of the labor force. It's a little bit more precise. And so if you want to read up on that one, there's a paper that just came out. Has the recession started? The bottom line is here in blue, which says they're thinking that the chances that we're in recession now are about 40%, but they don't know for sure. So that's just another rule that if you're interested in this, you could read up on that one. When we get the unemployment rate data, this is called the household survey. This is where we get the unemployment rate information. This was what was kind of interesting to me in this data, in that even though the unemployment rate went up, and 0.2 is a pretty sizable increase in the unemployment rate, a lot of things were positive in that month. And the civilian labor force going up by 420 is it's not a huge increase, but it's a sizable increase. What that means is that people either came into the labor force as employed or unemployed. And in this case, 67,000 more came in employed, but 352,000 came in unemployed. That's one way of thinking about it. So the labor force jumped, but part of the reason it jumped is because a lot more people are looking for work that don't have it. So there was a big increase. What would be a bad way to look at this would be if the civilian labor force were shrinking and your unemployment rate was going up. That would be really bad. It's not good when the unemployment rate goes up, but this big increase in the labor force sort of softens that a little bit. What we'll do is at the end of this section, we're almost done with the employment section. We've got a few more slides. We'll pause and we'll go through any questions that people have brought up. We'll go through the chat. So we will pause and get your questions if you have them. And again, if you certainly can interrupt me and we will pause and talk about it as needed. So the number of unemployed. So this is the number behind the unemployment rate. It's way below when Biden started. He started here. There were 10.2 million people unemployed. Now we're at 7.2. It came up 352,000 versus June. So that's a pretty big number. And at the trough, we were down at 5.7 million. So if you're one of these 1.3 million or so that are more unemployed, this economy is starting to hit you. And that's where the Fed has to look at this and say, is inflation tame enough to where we're willing to trade off and, do we want 1.3 million more unemployed to get inflation down? Are they willing to make that trade-off? And so far they have, and we'll see if in September, if they are going to, that's their next big meeting, if they're going to cut the rates in September to try to, move this number back down a little bit and hope that the inflation doesn't kick back up. So that's the quandary they're in, is they're always trading off between unemployment and GDP growth or, inflation. Unemployment and inflation are the two big, their mandate to keep inflation down, stable prices, and keep the unemployment rate down, try to keep us near full employment. So we know we're not at full employment right now. We're definitely, full employment is probably, we got down to about 3.4% unemployment under Biden. That's the lowest we've had going back to like 1969. Trump's low was 3.5, so Biden got a little lower. You can't always maintain that. Do you need to maintain 4.2 to keep inflation tame? That's what the Fed's got to figure out. Again, I won't go into details on this one, but this gives you an idea of what is driving the change in unemployment over the past year. So I'm using July of 2023, July of 2024. The biggest category of change, this 339, accounts for 47% of this increase. So 339 divided by about 12 or 1.2 million. is about 47. I'm sorry, the change was 47% from July 2023 here, 339 more on temporary layoff. This accounts for 28% of the overall share. So of this 1196, the 339 is about 28% of that. It tells you that that's the biggest bucket. That's the biggest category. We're seeing more temporary layoffs. That's better than having permanent job losers. We don't want those. And you've also got a fair amount of new entrants and temporary jobs that got completed, meaning ideally those people will find new ones. But this will give you a sense of what's going on behind the increase in the unemployment rate if you are interested in taking a look at that. One interesting fact that you don't hear in the news very much is that on average, Biden has the lowest unemployment rate of any president going back to about 1964. So back to Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. Biden has the lowest, and he passed LBJ, I think it was 3 months ago. He got below that 4.17. And so don't know how many of you have heard that in the news, but Biden, of any president, has the lowest unemployment rate on average in recent memory. Historically, Democrats run lower unemployment rates than Republicans. We don't have it all. You'll see several slides in here that look like this for different variables. But the history is that Democratic presidents far outperform Republican presidents. And it's not because of the Congress. It's just for whatever reason, it's unclear to economists that the Democrats, for whatever reason, significantly outperform Republicans. And we also do it with much lower deficits. One of the parts of that is that 10 of the last 11 recessions started under Republican presidents, and deficits have been about half the size under Democrats relative to the size of the economy, because those recessions drive deficits up, and also Republicans like to cut taxes. And so that combination has driven deficits up too. When you look at unemployment rate by group, so by the different races, comparing pre-pandemic 2019 and then 22 and 2023, green shading indicates the same or better result. So you can see that there's a lot of green here. The unemployment rates were the same or better under Biden in 2022 and 2023 than pre-pandemic under Trump. And if you remember, the media was gung-ho to say how 2019 was one of the best economies ever. And they were echoing what Trump was saying, which he was saying it in 2018 and 19, greatest economy ever. Well, okay, but not on these numbers. These numbers are even better under Biden. And I'll show you a slide at the end that will show you that almost every measure, even adjusted for inflation, was better in 2022 and 2023 under Biden than 2019 under Trump. That employment to population ratio is higher than pre-pandemic. That dotted line is the pre-pandemic number. So the latest reading, 80.9%, is actually up. It improved versus last month. And for some history, 2023 averaged 80.7, 2019 averaged 2019 averaged 80. That 89-point peak we've got, I should say July 2024, it's the highest since April of 01. 20 plus years, the highest reading for this measure. When people talk about immigrants, and I'll have several slides in here about immigration, this is one of the most important and unsung stories about what's happening right now in the economy. Immigrants, first of all, have been coming here in droves, and they are not crowding out native-born workers. They are, in fact, this is from Paul Krugman, Nobel Prize economist, writes for the New York Times. We've been able to achieve large increases in overall employment only because working-age immigrants have been coming to America. If we didn't have the immigrants, we wouldn't have the jobs. There was an enormous demand pent up in the pandemic. And and a lot of baby boomers, about 4.4 million, are turning 65 every year, and many of them are retiring. If you combine those factors, big demand coming out of the pandemic and all these people leaving that are retiring, you would have had a huge disconnect and things would have been a lot worse. Instead of just when we needed a supply of workers, we got it from the immigrants. It was like just in time delivery. It's like just what the doctor ordered. We needed all the help we could get, and they showed up in huge numbers. And the past few years with elevated immigration have been an era of exceptional growth in wages for the worst paid, meaning they didn't take money away from the poor. The poor actually got faster wage gains than the rich. And undocumented immigrants are good for the budget because they pay the payroll taxes, but they don't get Social Security or Medicare. So the immigrants coming in have been a huge blessing to the economy. And a lot of the media discussion is in that sort of conservative box of, did Kamala Harris do a good job of securing the border or not? It's like, we didn't really want the border secured from an economic perspective. We wanted as many immigrants as we could get. It worked brilliantly. But you probably won't hear Democrats make that case because they're a little nervous to do that. It's popular to beat up on immigrants, but thank goodness for them from an economic perspective. Here's just a statistic on that native-born workers' unemployment rate. It's jumping up a little bit lately along with the rest of it, but here's some stats. Under Biden, the native-born unemployment rate has averaged 4.1. And if you take out that first pandemic year when we were still elevated, that's 3.7. Trump for his full term, 5.0. And if you take out that pandemic, he was at 4. So Biden compares favorably to Trump pre-pandemic and definitely better than Trump full term. So saying that immigrants are crowding out native-born worker jobs, that's just not true. And last slide in this section is the what's called the job opportunity ratio, and that's measured here on the right side axis. What this is the ratio of job openings to unemployed. So how many jobs are out there per unemployed person? And before the pandemic, we were in this 1.2 range, and then we got all the way to 2, and now we've come back pretty much to where we were before the pandemic. And this isn't a statistic that's in the major news media a lot, but the Fed loves this statistic. This is sort of a pressure gauge for how tight the labor market is. And means very tight, meaning lots of demand for workers, wages jumping, it's inflationary. Down here is what they want to see, taking that pressure off. Then that helps them know that they can reduce interest rates without a lot of grief.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, let's open it up now. I'll pause there and let's talk about any slide you want in that section.
That last slide, if you go back to that last,
Sure.
Because it hits some of the stuff. On LinkedIn, if you're watching all the feed, we see that there are a lot of people that have been out of work, sometimes 1 or almost 2 years in IT, MarTech, human resources, customer success are the 4 big ones that I hear a lot about. And they're talking about these jobs that are being posted and that they aren't real because they're not getting hired. They keep staying up there and nobody's hiring for them. So I need to understand what this job opportunity ratio is. Are they counting jobs that people put out there, or are they counting jobs that are fulfilled?
No, they are definitely not filled jobs. They are counting jobs that are advertised. And I can't rattle off the definition of it. I'll have to look it up. But there is a strict definition of what qualifies for this, and it is definitely not filled jobs. It's open jobs. Now, definitely, though, what you're saying would be music to the Fed's ears, because they want to know that it's tougher to find a job right now. They're okay with a little bit more unemployment, as we talked about. So if corporations are starting to get hesitant to hire, that's a sign that the economy is slowing. And that's something the Fed likes, although that's not good news for workers, the workers in the categories you mentioned. Now, one thing I don't have in this presentation is a list of, or is sort of how many jobs were added or lost in a particular category. And I'll have to add that for next month to see if what you just said, if those categories are having some problems, because that information is available. And I may be able to get it during the break for you because it's easy enough to get. So when we do that, I'll grab it. But we'll be able to see if those categories are, at least in aggregate, are really problematic, or if it's something that is sort of anecdotal. We're seeing it on LinkedIn, but maybe it's not translating to the whole. So a fair question, good one. I don't have a great answer for you, but it is definitely it is true job openings. It is not filled jobs. You're seeing corporate hesitance to hire, and they're being picky. Other questions on this section? Let's see what we got here. Okay, FRED equals Federal Reserve Economic Data. Correct. Whenever you see this FRED and this nice blue outline here and these graphs, these are generated right out of the Federal Reserve database. It's fantastic. It's really easy to use. If you go to the FRED site, you can create your own account. They're free. And you can actually download all the slides that you like. And in these slides, you'll see the names of the item, and you can You can find it in there. I will tell you that the Fred search engine is a little clunky. So one of the best ways to find stuff is when you're in Google and you're searching, just type Fred space and then whatever economic term you're looking for. So all of these where I've used Fred, you can you'll be able to find all of these things very easily. If you just type Fred unemployment level, it's going to come up as one of your first search items and you get the chart right away. It's very intuitive to use. So I definitely recommend it. And you can use this presentation to practice. Like, can I generate Dave's slide? Go for it. It's a fun tool. I have a 5-year-old and he's going to learn Fred at a young age, which he's going to hold against me, I think, for a long time. All right, what else do we have here? I think that's it. Here we go. I thought the Great Recession was 1929. Okay, somebody's cracking jokes. There's no humor allowed on this call, by the way. This is a very serious group. No, I'm just teasing. So yeah, there was a depression back in 1929. We got pretty close though. I mean, this was a really miserable period of time in that, sorry, I keep bouncing around here, in that 2009 to 20, well, officially 2007, 2009, but we didn't regain the jobs peak until May of 2014. I can see somebody taking exception with the Fed saying the recession was over 3 or 4 years before we regained the jobs peak from before the recession. I kind of wish they would, the media and others and the Fed would use that kind of as a bar, is that you don't really say you're out of the recession until you've gotten back to the jobs level you had before the recession. And I mentioned here, we got back to the level of jobs in June of 2022. We've been in record territory ever since then. We're 6-point-something million jobs above that level. All right, any questions? Last chance before we go into GDP. All right, here we go. GDP now, we're talking about the size of the economy. And right now, the economy is as big as it's ever been. And this is real GDP, so this is adjusted for inflation. It's a quarterly measure. The economy is about 2 trillion bigger than before the pandemic, or almost 10% larger than it was before. And that's real. So it's not just about inflation that's been addressed. This is technically a measure of production, but there's something called real gross domestic income, which is supposed to match that. So you can think of this also as an income measure. And so we have got about 10% more income in this economy than before. And I'll show you the per capita numbers so you get a sense of that per household or per person. The GDP grew nicely as well. It grew let me mention this first. The US, this was as of the first quarter. So this data I just showed you before was through the second quarter. We're about 9% now bigger than we were before the pandemic. So the US has outgrown a lot of other highly developed, sophisticated economies with comparable inflation. This is the inflation rate, cumulative inflation. Over here for the US, they're using core. You'll hear somewhere around 20% for the non-core, and I'll get into that in a little bit. But for the most part, we've had better growth with comparable inflation to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world has experienced inflation. So when people pick on the US and say, well, Biden's Rescue Act caused all this inflation, I would take that with a grain of salt. It was probably a factor, but the Biden stimulus didn't affect every other major developed economy in Europe. And, it was other factors besides that. It was one factor of many, but you can see how fast we recovered with the jobs. I would argue that it was definitely worth it. But here's where we can see the latest. The number you always see in the news is GDP grew at 2.8% in the last quarter, 1.4% the quarter before that, and then some fast rates as we got out of the pandemic. This is unusually fast growth. This surprised a lot of people that we had sort of spiked up. Now people were expecting to see it here as we were coming out of the pandemic in 21, 22 early, but to see it like this in 2023 was a real surprise. People had a lot of demand pent up where they just couldn't buy stuff or didn't buy stuff, and they just went nuts and started doing it. And it's continued to some extent. 2.8 is a really solid growth. It's about what we've been growing, and I'll show you that in a minute. In here, it's also wide-based, meaning where'd the 2.8 come from? came from consumers. These numbers add up to 2.8. So these are the contribution to the change. Consumer spending is the biggest chunk, and that's the one you want to see solid, and it was. Inventory, so businesses were, if you add these two numbers, this is kind of what businesses are doing, almost, adds to 1.5. State and local government was a part of it, but not a huge part. And then imports are always a negative. That's money going out of the economy to buy stuff in a foreign country that's not US production, so they use that as a negative. These are good. It's a solid quarter. That's part of why when you say, are we in a recession? It's like, not with job creation and not with GDP adding 2.8%. That would be highly unusual. Now, here's kind of some interesting recent periods kind of looking at this GDP growth in context. Biden, throughout his administration, almost 2.8%. Trump, the GDP had recovered by the end of the Trump administration, even though employment hadn't, the GDP had come back, but still that was a period of time of a year when things didn't really move forward, year and a half. And so only 2% for his whole term. For the pre-pandemic, 2.8, so a little faster than Biden. And then Obama's first and second terms were sort of more typical, the 2 to 2.4 range, pretty typical. So this is pretty solid growth, as good as Trump before the pandemic, and in fact, as of the fourth quarter of 2023, Biden had just barely faster growth cumulatively than Trump. He was at 2.85. We're down a little bit here, but still 2.8 is a very solid quarter, and he's been growing at about that rate on average through his administration. This slide is real GDP per person. So this is dividing by all 300 and something million Americans. It's not per household, which would be a larger number. So this is just for a way of thinking about it for all the people that are here. It's up. It was 63,000 before the pandemic, and now it's 68,000. So up almost 5,000, or about 7.6% per person. Again, that's adjusted for inflation. So we're seeing more income, more production, more income in the United States than before the pandemic. And how big a contribution did immigrants make to this? Ernie Tedeschi he's a pretty big time economist. He was on, I think he was either the Council of Economic Advisors or the National Economic Council, but very well-known economist. I recommend following him on Twitter. You'll get a lot of really good quality information without a lot of noise, some great graphics. He's saying that about, about a fifth of the pandemic, with the post-pandemic growth in GDP, was because of immigrants coming in. And remember that the way an economy works, very simply, is your spending is my income and my spending is your income. So when you bring in lots of immigrants, their spending is our income, and that's a good thing. So they came in and they spent. They bought stuff, they buy services, they buy food. They don't just come here and take services and not buy anything. They create jobs in the world because they are buying stuff. They need things. And so this has helped boost growth here in the US. It's part of why I showed you that difference here. Immigrants are an important part of this gap. Why we're out to the right is because of thank your local immigrant. Now, one thing that will probably shock you is this next slide, which is one of my favorite reports. And I nerd out on Congressional Budget Office stuff. So I enjoy reading CBO reports, and this one was a real winner. What they basically said is that if you have robust immigration over the next decade, which is slowing, in their forecast is slowing quite a bit from where it's been in the last couple of years, but it's still solid. They're saying that is worth 65,000 per US household. More GDP, meaning more income, more wealth, and that's real. Well, I'm sorry, no, that isn't. That is 65,000 gross. That is not adjusted for inflation. Hopefully, we won't have much over the next decade. 65,000 per household, 9 trillion. And it's also bringing in about another $1 trillion in tax revenue, helping reduce deficits. If Trump were elected and were to block immigration, that we would lose that money. That money would not come in. And so you would see it in a variety of places. The stock market wouldn't grow as much. Not as many people would be working. Wages would not be as high. I mean, you've got a lot of different reasons why that GDP is growing. And it's just one of those things where when the demand is there, you want the supply to be there. and the way CBO is expecting things to go over the next decade, and they're as good at forecasting as anybody, this is what they think. 65,000 is what's on the table if Trump wins and blocks immigrants. And if he deports 10 million immigrants, then you're talking about, an economic calamity. You're talking about a severe recession, like 5% GDP shrinking. That's enormous. So we don't want to do that. You want to make sure you keep robust immigration happening. Ideally, it should be legal. We should have a lot more resources in integrating immigrants into our economy because we have so many aging people. But I encourage you to read that report. CBO writes for congressmen. And so I think they're not all accountants and economists. They're lawyers, but most of them are educated people, but it's written so that it can be understood. And there's a box here that kind of hits the highlights of it. When NBER is talking about GDP and recessions, they use 6 key measures besides GDP. These are 6 of the other measures they use. And we've talked about a few of them. So the the all employees total non-farm is the jobs. And then these other ones, I guess we've talked about that one specifically. The employment level, we didn't get into. It's another way of measuring how many people are working. The real personal consumption expenditures is a big part of GDP. I don't even know really what those last 2 are. I don't know the details of those. And the first one is really real personal income, excluding transfer receipts. Transfer receipts are like Social Security transfers. You take those out, take out government stimulus payments. Kind of how are people doing? Versus a year ago, all of them are up except one. This bottom one, industrial production total index, is down. The other 5 are all up over the past year or so. And if you try to eyeball this, like if you look here at this peak, if you were to draw a line vertically, are a lot of them down from there? Not really. You got this one's up, this one's sideways. Like if you drew, so I don't see a clear line in this saying, we've hit a peak. Things are still going up. The purple line, the blue line, the red line, they're all going up and they're all above, a year ago, except this guy. So let me pause there. Any questions on GDP? And I'm going to take a look at the chat as well. No new questions there. Any comments, questions about GDP before we go into the sort of wages and inflation? Good news, bad news here. And that's why those of you that were here last month, we get the inflation statistics tomorrow. So some of the numbers, this in data is about a month old, but the trends that I am going to show you are not going to change in 1 month. In fact, they'll probably get better, meaning we had a nice wage growth last month. I have that data, but I don't have the inflation data until tomorrow. So I'm just going to show you where we were through June, but understand if I were to update these tomorrow, it would be the same idea. The numbers would be a little different. And so that unless something very strange happens, you have a giant jump in inflation, which nobody's talking about, it should be a continuation of what I'm showing here. Contrary to popular view, hourly wages of production workers, that's about 80% of the private sector workers, the bottom 80%. So pretty good proxy for the middle class. Hourly wages have outgrown inflation throughout the post-pandemic era. From February of 2020, which is considered by economists to be the last pre-pandemic month. So before the economy started really going downhill and we did the lockdowns, February 20 was sort of the end of it. From there, hourly wages are up about 25%. CPI is up, that's the inflation, up about 21. And then the core inflation, so if you take food and energy out, up about 19. So we have more purchasing power than before the pandemic. And in fact, throughout the Biden era, we have had more purchasing power than before the pandemic. So if you liked 2019, you should have really liked, from a purchasing power perspective, the entire time frame under Biden, because real wages were up. And by real wages, I mean the blue line is above the red line, so that adjusted for inflation, real wages are up. And you can just subtract them. There's no fancy math. So hourly wages are up 25%. CPI all is up 20.8. What's the difference? 4.4. Real wages are up 4.4% over that time. That's 4.4% more purchasing power. If you look at from when Biden started, which is, as I'll explain in a minute, is an unfair comparison because of something interesting that was going on in the numbers. But even if you go from there, Biden, for the first time in June, just passed inflation. So the red line was above for much of that. It was above the blue line. So that's bad. CPI was above, but now it came below. So from January of 2021, when Biden started, we've had a very slight real wage increase. So much better pre-pandemic. And then if we go to when Biden started, it's finally caught up there. Now, why did that happen? And it helps to look at the actual number itself to understand this. This is the wage in terms of dollars per hour, and it's in June 2024 dollars. So it's adjusted for inflation. That's an apples to apples comparison. That's the red line. Lately, that's been $30.05 an hour. When Biden started, it was $30.01. So we're just 4 cents above that. But if you go back to February 2020, we were at 29 an hour. What happened here is not typical. There was a huge number of lower wage workers. So all those customer facing workers in retail and hotels, anywhere where they were interacting directly with people, a lot of them lost their jobs. And what that did is that people that were able to work from their computers at home kept their jobs. And so the average wage spiked up. Economists call that a compositional problem, meaning that 22 million people lost jobs, and a lot of them were lower paid workers. This suddenly spiked to 30, what does it look like, about 30.75 an hour. And then it fell as those workers started coming back in, and it was kicking along sideways for a while. Then the inflation really picked up, and so it fell. And now it's been coming up since middle of 2020. It's been rising. Now notice that even at this bottom point here, it's still better than pre-pandemic. We never got below pre-pandemic. And that's what this was showing you here, is they got really close. That's sort of here where these numbers got really close. But always, so purchasing power is better under Biden. The Congressional Budget Office, again, did another fantastic report. And this is one that says that as a share of your income, you could buy the same stuff you bought in 2019 and 2023 with a smaller share of your income. So you had more purchasing power in 2023 than 2019. You could buy that same basket of goods for a smaller share of your income. And that was true for all across the income spectrum. So a negative here in the bar is good. You could buy with a smaller percentage of your income. Now, of course, the rich did a little better, but still, everybody, more purchasing power in 2023 across the income spectrum. Not something you hear very often in the news, but 2023 was a very solid year. Very good real wages, people and income growth. People were able to buy stuff, more of the same stuff if you compare it apples to 2019. Kind of like that chart I showed you on unemployment, Biden also has the highest real wages of any president going back to 1964. And he's close to Trump. And notice that Nixon and Ford had very good numbers. So back in the middle 1970s, there was actually very high real wages. And then those wages fell for 25 years, and now they've come back up. So it looks like a bowl with 1995 or so at the center, 1974 or 5 being a peak, and now we have a peak again. These numbers, if you look at this slide again, all of these numbers in here, this plateau is higher than 1974 and 5. And in 2021, Biden this year here was the highest year ever on average. So Trump had some of this spike here, even if you include that, because it was only part of the year. This year turns out to be the highest year ever for real wages, meaning purchasing power. So Biden, again, he's the champ in real wages. Real wages and unemployment are incredibly important measures, and Biden is at the top. Now, this slide is going to intimidate you when you first see it, but I want to explain it. It's not as bad as it looks. This is the unemployment rate, so from 2 to 16%. This is the real hourly wage from $22 an hour to 31, and each dot is a month, going back to 1964. So you want to be in that upper left corner. You want to be up as high up here as you can. Low unemployment, very high real wages. And look where we are, where we were in June. Very close to the best economy ever on these two measures in June, not just the averages I've given you, but very, very solid. And these numbers over here are the baloney numbers that are from that giant spike that I showed you a couple slides ago. Oop, going the wrong way, sorry. You know, this giant spike right here is what this stuff is. You can ignore that. This is a fantastic economy. And I love this chart, even if it is a little intimidating. You know, there are hundreds of months here. We're way up in the corner where we want to be. Stop. All right, Bill, how are we doing? Did I lose you guys?
4 minutes.
Okay, we've got a 4 minute. Thank you. All right, so stock market. This is, I call these the racetrack charts. What this does is it superimposes the Biden and Trump administrations at the same time in their tenure. So these are the trading days from election. And I use election because the stock market is a leading indicator. It reacts right away when there's big political news. And Trump also liked to talk about his performance from election because there was a big increase right after he was elected, as there was under Biden. In fact, the first year for Biden from election, the stock market was up, like you can see here, it hit like, it was up like 36% in Biden's first year, which is a record from election. It was the fastest, sprint out the gate, if you will, for any president for the S&P 500. And right now they're almost tied. Biden is like a hair higher than Trump. Trump had this big drop off for the pandemic, and then it recovered, basically back to where his peak was, just a hair under 60, and Biden's the same. So if you had $100, and I'm not going to be able to do the second part of this math, but if you had $100 when Trump started, it was 158 when he left, and then whatever that is times 1.6 is where you are now with Biden. Your 401k has been doing tremendously well, meaning you add the Biden gains on top of the Trump gains. You have to multiply, but it's 1.6%, 1.6 times where you were. So it's fantastic increase in the stock market over the both people. So they're tied. And here's the numbers from inauguration through August 9th. So from election, plus 59% for Biden, from inauguration, plus 39, both really solid numbers. And when you start going back to before the pandemic, the net worth of the bottom 50% group is up 94%. This is not adjusted for inflation because I've got inflation on here. Plus 94%. This is mostly housing, big increases in housing, and also net worth was fairly low for the bottom 50%, so it's easier to have a big percent gain on that, but still. The 50th to 90th group, plus 48. The hourly wages, plus 25, as I showed earlier, and inflation, plus 21. So not just are you ahead on wages, but you're way ahead on the net worth because of that stock market and the housing price increases. The net worth of Americans it actually hit the highest it's ever been adjusted for inflation during 2022. And for that bottom 50th group, you can kind of see it here. Early 2022, we peaked on these two measures. We're a little bit higher than that for the bottom 50% group now. But when you adjust for inflation, it's not really higher. The net worth of the 50th to 90th group, same story. It's about the same that it was, a little bit higher than 2022 when you adjust for it. So things have been moving kind of sideways here, but still way higher than before the pandemic. All right. And I think this is the last slide in the section, so that works out. Let me finish this one, then we'll take a break. Like those other slides, if you average where the real net worth is per household in that bottom 50% group, averages higher under Biden than any of these recent presidents. We only have this data back to 1989. And it's updated every quarter, but it's late in the quarter. So we won't get the second quarter for another month or so. So through the first quarter of this year, 57,000 net worth on average for that group. And here are the numbers for the other presidents. Obama's at the bottom because a lot of that group got killed because their housing went down. The Great Recession just destroyed the net worth of people. And it wasn't because of Obama. Bush probably 43 and a variety of reasons for that crisis, but not regulating the banks being a big part of it. Bush 43 still had a higher level on average, but the cause of the Obama level was from the Bush era. But still, if you just look at the presidents, this is where we are, doing very well. Biden on those three measures I shared, unemployment rate, real wages, net worth of the bottom 50% group, best of any president on average. All right, we will pause there.